Hey friends, thanks so much for joining us again. It's been a little bit too long, and I want to thank our guest, James Wesley Rawles, for joining us today. He's an author and the founder of survivalblog.com. James, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you, and I would be remiss not to thank our daily contributor, Rory, for setting this interview up. Peter is also on the line. Hello, gentlemen.
Hello.
Hello.
And what I would like to do is turn the first couple of questions over to Rory, because, James, I know you and he talked for about 10 minutes the other day. Rory, why don't you run with the ball?
All right. Thank you so much, Sean, and thank you very much, James, for joining us today. And I want to start out with, I understand that you have two different projects that are forthcoming. And if you would, just introduce our audience to these projects and let them know when to look for them.
Sure. Well, in the immediate future, on the 1st of October, my next novel, which is titled Expatriates, is coming out. That's from E.P. Dutton and Company. And it's another near-future novel in the Patriots series, but there's virtually no crossover characters with my older books. It's set contemporaneous with the other novels, and I wanted to use this novel to kind of show the expatriate view of what living through the collapse would be like and all the uncertainty that they would face with a lack of communication with their families back at home and seeing things unravel from a distance.
Sounds interesting.
So that's coming out the 1st of October. And I've also just finished the manuscript for a nonfiction book. It's another book for Penguin, and it's titled Tools for Survival. And that will be coming out probably in May or June of 2014.
That sounds good.
And it's kind of a general book on tools with an emphasis on 19th century technology. Because I anticipate a grid down situation where we won't have access to grid power. So people basically have to revert to 19th century technology, basically things like home foundry, home forge level of technology to be able to carry on. I don't anticipate, if things go really sideways, people being able to get a hold of things like wire for MIG welders or exotic welding gases, for example. So we're talking 19th century forge technology.
If I may, guys, it's interesting. I was just listening to a podcast on the way home on the flight today, and James, I'm going to jump in and steal Rory's thunder just for a second and follow up on that, because if the grid goes down, which I think you've said, if the grid goes down, the casualty count in the United States of America and North America is going to be horrific. I've heard estimates in a podcast today that 90% of the population could perish if the grid goes down, be it from an EMP blast or, sun activity, solar flares, a major solar flare, things of that nature. Can you stress to people how important it is to learn basic fundamentals of survival in order? Because if the population in this country, as kind of spoiled as we are, is suddenly thrust back into 17th century, living standards, we're doomed, especially those of us in the north.
Well, yeah, things will be very difficult for people in northern climates, but basically anywhere where there's high population density, we have a society that's not used to living with third world living standards. People are used to lights that come magically on with a flick of a switch and toilets that wonderfully flush with a flip of a lever. And people in our country simply don't know how to live with third world standards. And I think from a sanitation standpoint and a public health standpoint, it's going to be an absolute nightmare, because people will be fouling their own water supplies without realizing it. And the amount of disease, things like dysentery, are just going to be absolutely rampant. And between exposure to the elements, lack of food, and sanitation issues alone, we may see a 50% die-off of the population, not to mention physical violence, which will probably be off the charts.
I have a follow-up question, and then I'm gonna shut up. And it's this. We continue to hear the DHS and people in positions of power in this government talk about not if, but when the grid goes down. Not if, but when these terrible things happen. And I've heard Janet Napolitano say there's a 100% chance that this is going to happen. Don't you think that kind of fear-mongering is absolutely irresponsible? And maybe beyond that, it's actually telegraphing a potential false flag in the future that would bring the people to their knees in this country?
Well, I unfortunately, I would say we probably have a 90% chance of short-term grid interruptions where all three American grids could go down simultaneously. And that could happen because of a hacker attack on the SCADA software that's used to control the American power grid all the way from production to your home power meter, or because of a solar flare, or because of an EMP attack. There's any number of things that could bring all three grids down. So that, I think that 100% number is out of line, but I could safely see 90%. The question is the duration of that grid down event. Is it going to be down for 24 hours, 48 hours, or 48 months? That's the question. And if there is the grids go down and stay down, that's where we run into the possibility of a massive depopulation, a massive die-off. Now, is it fear-mongering? Is it setting people up for a false flag attack? Perhaps. But the threat is real.
Which is kind of scary.
It's more than scary. That's why I live way out in the Hinter Boonies, and I encourage people to relocate if they have the chance.
Well,
can you give me directions to the Hinter Boonies? Where are the Hinter Boonies? 'Cause I want to go to there.
I'm a big proponent of the inland Northwest. I selected a 5-state region, which includes Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, and the eastern halves of both Oregon and Washington as what I refer to as the American Redoubt. After a lot of study and a lot of prayer, I came to the conclusion that it's the safest place for people to be because of its light population density primarily, and because of its fairly diverse agriculture and a relatively livable climate, at least west of the Great Divide. I think it's the safest place from an actuarial standpoint for anyone to live. And I do encourage people to relocate if they have the chance. But even for someone who simply cannot relocate because of either family responsibilities or work responsibilities, I understand that. I just want to encourage people to become as prepared as possible. And if there is a grid down collapse, people may have to hunker down in their homes for many months and essentially wait for a die-off before they'll be able to emerge. And for anyone who lives in the eastern third of the country, that die-off period could be quite precarious to live through.
Well, and that's exactly where I live. I live in FEMA Region 4, and I live about a 4-minute drive from the epicenter of a major metropolis. Mm-hmm. Population density is about 650,000 people, typical U.S. county.
Wow.
And it's and I just read an article the other day that over at shtfplan.com, where they were talking about 50% of the population lives in 146 counties, and
That's
the county,
right.
and out of 3,000 counties, and it's the situation that I'm faced with is that I can't move, and that's kind of the focus that I've got for the remainder of the show is how can we get the folks better prepared. And the first question that I have is, James, is you can see that the density of population where I live is an issue. And my wife and I, we do have some preps, your basics, your bullets, beans, Band-Aids, and bullion, and what I refer to as level 1. And where should I go from here in regards to prep items like energy generation, more security? What should be at the top of my list?
Well, actually, for someone in an urban area who plans to hunker down and doesn't plan to bug out to live with country cousins, one thing that should actually be at the top of everyone's list, but that's very much overlooked, is if you're in a situation where you have power because you have photovoltaics or whatever, but your neighbors don't, you really should concentrate on blackout curtains for your windows, and God forbid you have sliding glass doors, but you need to basically black out your house completely without any light leaks so that your house will look just as black as any other on your block. Otherwise, you're going to be targeted as the rich guy.
Right.
You don't want to be a come loot me beacon at night.
Okay,
I think that should be a fairly high priority for you. And in my blog, I mentioned that there's a number of theatrical supply houses that sell rolls of heavy felt that they use in play productions and in movie productions that is fantastic. Just one thickness of this stuff will stop all of the light coming out of windows.
Right.
And if you use the heavy black gaffer tape with it, you can achieve a full blackout effect. If you have to hunker down at home, you're going to have to. If there's so many things that are going to go into it, if we're truly in a grid down situation, you're going to have to think in terms of not just food storage, but where you can collect rainwater or surface water, whether it's a pond or a creek, and how you're going to transport that water home without access to a gas engine vehicle. Boy, your chances of survival are fairly low if you're in a major metropolitan area. But in a true grid down situation, I would recommend that you literally be prepared to hunker down for months.
Yes. Yeah. Next thing, James, how is it that I'm going to be able to cook without drawing too much attention? I mean,
right. Well, Rory, you're going to want to be able to cook without any spices whatsoever. You don't want any spicy. And from an efficiency standpoint, there's a special cooking method that's basically like crock-pot cooking, but without electricity, where you bring water to a boil and you use a special insulated cooker. They're very popular in Japan. It's essentially like crock-pot cooking, where you bring water to a boil, you're going to add your rice, your meat, vegetables, or whatever, and you're going to enclose it in a double insulated container. You can either buy them commercially made or fabricate your own, basically where you take a crock pot insert and you're going to wrap it with a bunch of layers of towels and put it in a cardboard box, and then a bunch of towels over the top. And with that cooking method, you have a couple of advantages. One is you don't have cooking odors escaping.
Yep.
And the other is you have the absolute minimum energy input. It's all at the beginning to bring the water to a boil. So with a very small propane stove, for example, or a very small charcoal stove, if you have that luxury of being able to cook outdoors, you bring water to a boil, you bring it inside the house, and then you do all your cooking.
See, as far as cooking outdoors, that's the part that
in your case, concern. You might get away with cooking in your garage if you have an attached garage for your house. Bring water to a boil, bring it inside, and then do your cooking that method. That's just one example of the workarounds that you can use in an urban or suburban environment if you literally can't trust your ravenous neighbors.
Well,
frankly,
I'll tell you,
I
like
wouldn't want to live that way. I would rather bug out and live with country cousins. But for someone who has to hunker down, you're going to have to think through each of those situations, whether it's sanitation, cooking, home security, communications, the whole works. You're going to have to think through each of those. And unfortunately, in an urban environment, you can do everything right. But if your neighbors can't adapt, you're still going to end up just as dead because, as I mentioned before, the sanitation situation is going to be horrendous. And if people are literally going door to door, kicking in the front doors of houses, eventually they're going to get to your house.
Right.
If it's that bad, if it's a total worst case, your chances are not that good hunkering down in place. You may beat the odds, but I would rather be somewhere else, frankly.
Well, we've got a place that we can get to assuming that we can actually physically get to it because of
That's the other question. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because of the density of the population that we're dealing with, the density issue, it's crazy. And we are looking right now to relocate, and just we don't know how that's gonna pan out as far as being able to keep the umbilical cord to the city and get far enough away from it to where we can create a more defensible homestead. But
well, Rory, you're in the same situation as probably 30 or 40% of my readership. So don't feel like you're alone.
No,
There's a lot of people that would love to relocate, but either for financial reasons or family obligations or work obligations, or also health considerations. A lot of people have chronic health situations where they need to live near a major medical center.
Right.
You're not alone.
Well, and that's why I wanted to focus on that. Because I know there's a lot of people that are in the same. I mean, if 50% of our population is concentrated in 146 counties out of 3,000, that right there tells me everything I need to know as far as who's listening to this interview, and the people that we need to address.
Like I say, your situation is not unique, Rory.
Exactly.
But a level of planning that you'll have to make is definitely a step up from your average suburbanite, or certainly someone who lives in a rural area. You're going to have to think everything through. You're going to have to shepherd your funds and prioritize your purchasing and your training with exactitude, because all it takes is one overlooked area and you're another statistic.
Well, just like the blackout curtains, that was something that's something that I've completely overlooked and hadn't even thought of. So I appreciate that in itself. I'd like to move on. Peter, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Do you have anything for James at this point? Would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I sure would. Just talking about James's thoughts on ammo in general, what he's seeing these days, and specifically what's going on in the world of, say, 22 LR and 9mm.
Oh, boy. Well, we're in a very exceptional period right now. I generally tend to encourage people to buy common calibers and stock them in depth. For anyone like me who I literally bought almost 100,000 rounds of 22 long rifle a couple of years ago, I ended up sitting pretty in this situation. I was able to help out a few people. But for anyone who's trying to stock up right now, it's a very difficult situation. And if you might want to look at regional peculiarities for ammunition. Depending on where you live, there may be a very particularly popular cartridge for deer hunting. That's one thing to look at. Another would be, what is the caliber carried by your local law enforcement? If you're a 9mm or a 45 kind of guy, but all your local cops and sheriff's deputies are carrying 40 Smith & Wesson, you might want to rethink that. So you've got to look at regional peculiarities. You have, for anyone who lives in a border region, there's a whole other set of circumstances that that come into play. If there's if anyone near the Canadian border might want to think in terms of possibly having at least one rifle that's chambered in .303 British. So there's a lot of things that come into play. All I can say is, take the opportunity when the supply of ammunition does loosen up and prices do return to normal, and I think they will within the next 6 months. Take that opportunity to stock up in depth. If you currently own any guns that are in oddball calibers, I recommend that you sell them off unless they have particular, family heirloom qualities to them. If you own a 257 Roberts or a 496 Belchfire Magnum or whatever, it's important that you trim down your list of calibers to ones that are commonly available. Not only will that give you the advantage of being able to stock up more inexpensively and reliably now, but when everything hits the fan, if you have some antique caliber or oddball caliber after everything hits the fan, you won't have the opportunity to restock. It's just not going to be available. If you find any in an oddball caliber, it's going to be a miracle. So I know everyone has their favorite pet caliber or whatever, but at least have a few guns that are in the most common calibers. And let me give you a short list. 22 long rifle, certainly. 9mm, 38 Smith & Wesson or 357 Magnum, 40 Smith & Wesson, and 45 automatic for handguns. And for rifles, either 5.56 NATO or 7.62 NATO. And for shotguns, plain old 12 gauge, 2 3/4 inch. That pretty well covers it for most of the people living in North America. You know, if you live in Alaska, you might want to have a serious bear caliber, for example, or moose caliber. But for anyone else, the list that I just gave should cover all your bases.
Hey, Jim, just kind of follow-up question on that. You know, with the ammo shortage and everything, one thing that kind of struck me was there was never a shotgun ammo shortage. And can you comment on when and if you see that happening? I mean, there's always tons of 12 gauge. So I stocked up on that.
Only when everything is falling apart, or if we saw a hyperinflationary situation where people are rushing to get their money out of dollars and into tangibles, well, I think that's about the only time where we'll see a shortage of shotgun ammunition. Shotguns, are increasingly becoming specialty guns. Granted, there's a lot of eastern states where you can only hunt deer with shotguns, and in those states, I would put an emphasis on stocking up on shot shells. Otherwise, I think that there will always be a decent supply of 12 gauge out there. 20 gauge, perhaps. Certainly shy away from 16 gauge or 28 gauge because they're oddballs nowadays. Yes, there were, with the recent shortages, there were some peculiarities. For a while there, you couldn't find 22 long rifle, but you could find 22 Magnum, and you could find 17 HMR for a while. So perhaps there is an advantage in having a few guns in unusual calibers, but don't make those your primary guns, and don't stock that ammunition up in depth when you should be stocking the more common calibers.
And those can become barter items as well, right?
Exactly, yes. You want to have the most common ammunition, plus, as I mentioned before, there may have a regional favorite. If you're in a state where everyone hunts with 30-30, you may want to stock up 10 or 12 boxes of 30-30 ammo, even if you don't own a rifle in that caliber, just for purposes of barter.
Sean, you want to jump back in? Or
Well, James, I guess I was wondering what your thoughts are on World War III, which is an awfully large question. But, we've been talking so long about a dollar collapse and how horrific, that will be eventually for the American people. But it seems to me that a Syrian conflict leading us down the path to World War III would be far, far worse. What do you make of what we are currently seeing in the Middle East with these war drums that continue to be beating from both the neocons, the Republicans, and the Democrats in the Obama administration? And what do you make of Putin offering a counterbalance to this aggressiveness?
Well, the chances of this regional conflict blowing up into a true global conflict, I think, are fairly small. But the consequences of World War III, as you mentioned, would be huge, because we could very well see an escalation to the use of nuclear weapons, and in a worst case, we could see a full-scale exchange between Russia and the United States, or even China could come into play. It could get very ugly if it does happen. And from a prepper standpoint, I think the important thing to keep in mind is balanced preparations. Obviously, if you've geared your whole life to preparedness for an economic collapse and we end up getting nuked, it could be more than just embarrassing. You could end up very dead. So it's important that people, at the very minimum, stock up on things like potassium iodide or potassium iodate that the chemical formula for that's written KiO3, and it happens to be the name of one of the companies that specializes in selling that. Definitely want to hedge your bets. If you don't have at least a plan for creating a hasty fallout shelter for your family, you're definitely behind the power curve, and you definitely should have some potassium iodide or potassium iodate. It's very difficult to predict how this is all going to play out. Again, I think the chances of it going global are probably small, but again, the implications are huge if it does. Most of the preps that people make work across the board, but there's a few, like I just mentioned, that are specific to a nuclear scenario, or there's a few that are specific to biological warfare, which is another possibility here. People need to plan ahead and at least mitigate the biggest risks in each of those areas.
Thank you for that. It warrants talking about. I mean, at the end of the day, we have a large listenership who are people of faith, and very often we see in the comments people saying, trust in the Lord and trust in God, because at this point a lot of this is literally in God's hands. You and I think, have talked about this in the past, James, about there being spiritual warfare on the planet. Those who do not believe in an afterlife and are atheists are completely entitled to that belief, and I don't disparage them for it. They're entitled to it. But those of us that do believe in a higher power, in an afterlife, in a creator of this universe, we do see spiritual warfare on this planet, and I think at the end of the day, it really is in God's hands. I think good men and women have to stand up to tyranny and speak out. That is our duty. But in the big picture, isn't this truly all in God's hands at this point?
It is, but you have to kind of take it a step further and ask yourself, how does God want me to live? For anyone who is a man of faith, you have to ask yourself, what is my responsibility to my family? Right. What do I need to do to fulfill my responsibility as a father and as the head of a household and as the spiritual head of a family? What's my responsibility? What do I need to do physically to prepare my family to meet that responsibility? And I also write a lot in my blog and in my books about the importance of Christian charity. And I consider that part of my Christian duty as well. So I've stocked up extra, especially things like wheat and rice, in very large quantity, because I see my responsibility from an Old Testament standpoint, with the Old Testament rule of tzedakah, to help my neighbors to the best of my ability. My philosophy is to give until it hurts. But another part of my philosophy is to give truly anonymously, to give at arm's length, so I don't put myself and my family at risk by giving charity. I don't want to be targeted as the guy who has everything. Otherwise, I'll end up with neighbors that keep coming back again and again, to the point where they're going to be coming at me at gunpoint if they're starving to death. So I take the philosophy of giving anonymously, and as a Christian, my approach has been to give through my local church. I've already made arrangements with an elder in my church. I've let him know that I have some extra storage food, and that I will be very quietly, discreetly getting it to him to dispense charitably. But I don't want my name to ever be mentioned, and he's agreed to that.
Fair.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and I think it's just, a lot of us look to you for an example and as a mentor, and I just think that's a powerful example, and we should all take heed and try to do something similar. Rory, I'll toss it back to you.
Well, the last question that I have, Jim, for now, and it's along these lines of what you guys were just talking about, and it has to do with family, and in particular, my family. And my parents are both sound asleep. My mom actually referred to what I do with SGT Report as propaganda. That was the word that she used. And yeah, that was my reaction too. I laughed, so it's like, oh my goodness. And this was literally 3 days ago that she said this. And do you have any way or any suggestion of how I can reach someone that is sound asleep, someone that is close? I can't do anything for the masses but somebody that is family, somebody that is meaningful to me. What tools would you suggest to help to bring them into the fold, to at least open their eyes?
Well, your situation is far from unique. I think the vast majority of people listening to my voice right now have at least one family member who's a doubting Thomas, or Pollyanna, as they used to say in the pre-Y2K world. People with their head thrust firmly in the sand, who don't want to hear any of this.
Right.
There's a small portion of the population you're never going to get through to, that are never going to believe you. And it won't be until the day after everything hits the fan that they end up on your front porch looking very sheepish, asking for help. You'll never be able to help people in that category beforehand. You're basically going to have to stock up for them and prepare for them to the best of your ability. With the other family members who might come around, who have some common sense and who will listen to reason, I think one of the best things you can do is actually hand them a piece of fiction. Hand them some preparedness-oriented survival fiction, whether it's a book or a movie. Try to don't hand them anything in the zombie, kind of genre. You're trying to appeal to their reason, so don't hand them irrationality.
Right.
But if you can hand them a good piece of survival fiction, like a novel like Lucifer's Hammer, or a novel like Alas, Babylon, for example, if they'll take the time to read that, odds are, with the majority of them, if they have a rational brain, something will click and they'll realize, oh, yeah, I do have to prepare. Then you've got the next challenge, which is the hurdle of getting them to reprioritize their budget so that their budgets are no longer geared toward 56-inch plasma HD TVs and jet skis and European vacations, to reprioritize their budget and get their families squared away. That's your next step in the process. But I think the first step would be, following some concerted prayer to hand them some survival fiction and see if it sinks in.
That sounds reasonable, and possibly even doable.
Yeah, and I just want to say, I think it just tying it back to the Christian ideal, which is a spirit of forgiveness. I find it very insulting when family members do what your mother did, Rory, because it's so dismissive. Yeah. And I think for those of us who have a wider worldview, I think most of us in this space, even if we didn't believe what we believe, are the type of people that wouldn't say that to somebody else because it's very hurtful.
Yes.
But the fact that she said it, I think, just speaks to the fact that there are so many people out there that cannot speak the language and are not equipped with the tools to have a dialogue of any sort as it relates to any of the things that we talk about, which are fact-based topics: international banking, criminal cartels, those that would collude against the people, the military-industrial complex, false flag terrorism and acts of terrorism, rooted in history. These things are what we cover, and it has absolutely nothing to do with propaganda, as you guys know. It's the antithesis, it's the antidote to the propaganda shoved down our throats by CNN and Fox News and MSNBC and the New York Times and all those mockingbird media sources. And so it's a shame that your mom hasn't taken the time to investigate these things a little further. But I do think people are waking up. And maybe the best single example of that is the polls that suggest overwhelming, what is the word? What's opposite of support? Resistance. Thank you. Resistance to this war in Syria. The American people are absolutely fed up. And even those that can't articulate
across the board,
why,
yes.
They're fed up.
Yeah, in fact, there's a wonderful parody sketch that came from Second City, which is a left of center comedy group.
Oh, I just heard that.
Which was the,
I'm going to post that. Thank you for triggering that.
Yeah, the Jumpstart World War III video.
Mm-hmm.
It's gone absolutely viral, and it's resonating with people from all ends of the political spectrum.
It's brilliant.
You're right. This planned war in Syria is about as unpopular a war as I've ever seen. It's absolutely anathema. So yes, people are waking up, and that is encouraging. But let's be realistic and pragmatic about this. Odds are the majority of the electorate is not going to force any kind of change. And even if we were to attempt a change, there would be still the possibility of circumstances that are beyond our control that are going to come crashing down on us, whether it's an economic collapse, whether it's a biological war, whether it's a purely natural disaster, something like a massive solar flare of a Carrington event scale. There's any number of things that are just about inescapable, even if we are able to corral the political process. So it's important that families get prepared to the very best of their ability. I do encourage people to not go totally down Periscope. People need to continue to be politically active. Although I do encourage people to develop additional personas and email addresses and a web presence that can't be attributable to them, and to operate through VPN for their web access for the sake of privacy. I do encourage people to be fully engaged politically and to speak up to the best of their ability. But the pragmatist in me says, always have a plan B, and odds are we're probably going to need it in our lifetime.
Yeah, we are, and I just want to call attention to that video that you cited. It's called Help Kickstart World War III, and it's been put out by the Second City Network, Second City down in Chicago, founded by the late, great John Candy. It really, really speaks to the nature of people on the left and right coming together and realizing, they mention in this criminal banking, the military-industrial complex. More war is more money for the private interests. It's really, really a brilliant piece. The last thing I just want to mention is that, nobody is getting a check from the CFR or from any of these major corporations at SGT Report over at survivalblog.com. So please do support our sponsors. We have a shared sponsor who does great work, campingsurvival.com.
Excellent company.
Excellent company. If you do need to do some prepping, please click through the banner at SGT Report for campingsurvival.com, or do so over at Survival Blog, and show a little love and support those guys. Tom over at campingsurvival.com is a great guy. He really wants the truth out, and he's kind enough to sponsor sites like mine and Survival Blog, and I'm just grateful for that. I want to give him a shout out. James, I'm going to throw it to Rory to say goodbye.
Well, all right. Well, I certainly appreciate your time this evening, James, and it's been great, and I could spend probably another 2 hours with you easily, and I really hope that we can do this again real soon.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. I hope folks get a chance to check out the archives at my blog. A lot of authors spend a lot of time chit-chatting about their books because they want to sell books. My main goal as an author is to motivate people to get prepared. I highly recommend that people take full advantage of all the free information that's available in my blog's archives. I don't charge for any subscriptions. The archives are very deep and very broad. Basically, any topic that you need to cover for family preparedness is going to be there. And again, it's all available free. Please take full advantage of it, folks. I'll be praying Psalm 91 for all of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. A real pleasure again. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, gentlemen.